They noticed everything before you ever spoke. In the Gilded Age, appearance was not decoration, it was evidence of breeding, of restraint, of belonging. A glove worn too loosely, a color chosen out of season, a hemline cut a fraction too boldly could speak louder than any introduction. Society did not correct these errors aloud. It simply recorded them, quietly, and remembered. This world operated on silent scrutiny. Drawing rooms, opera boxes, promenades, and dining tables became courts of unspoken judgment where posture, fabric, cleanliness, and composure were weighed with ruthless precision. One did not need to break a law to be cast aside. One only needed to look. Wrong. This is the story of those rules that were never written down, yet rigidly enforced. The invisible codes that governed faces, bodies, and clothing, and the quiet consequences faced by those who failed to master the art of appearing acceptable in a society built on wealth, performance, and fear of exposure. In the Gilded Age, entry into society did not begin at the door, it began at a distance. Long before a foot crossed a threshold or a name was announced, the eye had already rendered its verdict. Clothing, grooming, and bearing formed a silent credential system, one that required no explanation and offered no appeal. To appear correctly was to be provisionally accepted. To fail was to remain perpetually outside, regardless of wealth, lineage, or intent. Dress was not merely fashion, but fluency. Every garment communicated restraint or excess, familiarity or aspiration. Fabric weight mattered, finishing mattered. Even the manner in which a coat settled on the shoulders or a skirt responded to movement signaled whether the wearer had learned the rules from birth or acquired them through imitation. Nothing about appearance was neutral. It functioned as a visual resume, scanned and interpreted in seconds by a society trained to read minute distinctions. Grooming reinforced this hierarchy. Cleanliness was assumed among the respectable, but its execution demanded subtlety. Too pristine suggested labor performed by others, too visibly acknowledged. Too careless implied neglect, disorder, or moral looseness. Hair was expected to appear controlled without seeming arranged, faces composed without evidence of effort. The goal was not beauty, but legitimacy. One was meant to look as though refinement required no conscious maintenance. Even stillness carried meaning. The way an individual occupied space, how they stood, sat, or waited, was scrutinized with the same rigor as attire. Nervous movement betrayed uncertainty. Excessive confidence hinted at vulgarity. The correct posture was neither assertive nor submissive, but practiced, inherited, and seemingly effortless. Society did not teach this posture openly, it absorbed it through repetition, observation, and quiet correction. Admission then was conditional and constantly reassessed. A single, successful appearance did not grant permanence. Each social encounter renewed the examination. Appearances could be questioned, downgraded, or revoked without notice. Invitations ceased, conversations cooled, recognition faltered. The individual was not accused, they were simply no longer included. In this way, appearance functioned as both gatekeeper and guard. It preserved boundaries without confrontation and enforced conformity without explicit rule. To belong in the Gilded Age was not merely to possess wealth or pedigree. It was to look, at all times, as though one had never needed to try. In Gilded Age society, the body itself was understood as a public instrument, one that required constant regulation. It was not enough to dress correctly. One had to move, pause, and exist within one's clothing in a manner that affirmed belonging. The untrained body revealed itself not through overt transgression, but through subtle disobedience, gestures that lingered too long, movements that carried excess urgency, expressions that arrived before restraint could intervene. From childhood, the body was instructed in silence. Posture was corrected not through explanation, but through repetition, furniture, and expectation. Chairs were designed to discourage collapse. Corsetry and tailoring enforced verticality, shaping the spine into compliance. Stillness was praised. Restlessness was interpreted as immaturity or moral instability. The ideal body appeared disciplined without visible effort, as though social order had been inscribed directly into muscle and bone. Gesture was equally regulated. Hands were expected to move with purpose, but never emphasis. Pointing, grasping, or reaching too assertively risked association with labor or impatience, both disqualifying traits in refined spaces. Facial expressions followed the same logic. Emotion was permitted only within narrow bounds. Excess joy appeared unserious. Visible sorrow suggested personal disorder. Anger, unless masked by wit or distance, was simply unacceptable. The face was trained to register interest without intensity and concern without urgency. Even the act of walking became a form of examination. Pace communicated intention. Too fast suggested anxiety or ambition. Too slow implied entitlement or indifference. The correct tempo was one that accommodated observation, allowing others to assess without being forced to acknowledge the assessment taking place. One moved as though aware of being seen, yet careful never to appear conscious of the gaze itself. This discipline extended to physical presence in shared spaces. Bodies were expected to occupy just enough room to be noticed, never enough to impose. To lean too far into conversation, to shift weight too visibly, to allow fatigue to surface in posture, all signaled a failure of internal regulation. Society valued bodies that appeared endlessly capable, quietly enduring, and untouched by strain. Through this careful training, the body became both proof and performance. It testified to upbringing, class familiarity, and social fluency without uttering a word. And for those whose bodies could not be fully schooled, through illness, age, or difference, the consequences were swift but unspoken. The body, once noticed for its deviation, was never allowed to disappear again. In Gilded Age society, cleanliness was never merely hygienic, it was interpretive. It invited judgment not only of circumstance, but of character. A clean appearance implied discipline, moral clarity, and self-governance. Any deviation, however slight, suggested an interior disorder that could not be spoken aloud but was immediately understood. Cleanliness, paradoxically, had to appear effortless. To look scrubbed raw hinted at anxiety, insecurity, or recent proximity to labor. To appear even faintly soiled, creased cuffs, dulled shoes, a collar that betrayed wear, invited assumptions far beyond negligence. It implied instability, financial precarity, or a life conducted too closely to necessity. Society did not inquire which explanation applied. The visual evidence was considered sufficient. Color operated under similar scrutiny. Palettes were governed by season, occasion, age, and social position, though few of these rules were ever articulated. Certain shades suggested restraint and taste. Others hinted at vulgarity or aspiration improperly displayed. Brightness carried suspicion. Excess contrast implied attention-seeking. Dark tones signaled sobriety, but if worn without balance, could suggest mourning unearned or melancholy uncontained. To choose incorrectly was to reveal either ignorance or defiance, both equally dangerous. White, in particular, carried moral weight. Its presence implied purity, order, and the privilege of distance from physical work. Yet it demanded constant maintenance, making it a quiet display of resources rather than virtue alone. A white garment stained or yellowed did more damage than one never attempted. It announced failure. In a language society was fluent in reading. These judgments extended beyond clothing to skin, scent, and general presentation. The body was expected to emit no evidence of effort, illness, or exertion. Perspiration was not simply uncomfortable, it was socially incriminating. So too were lingering odors of industry, medicine, or poverty. Even health was moralized. Pallor might be tolerated if it appeared delicate. Pallor that suggested exhaustion or deprivation was not. What made these assumptions particularly powerful was their invisibility. No accusation was made, no correction offered. Instead, reputations shifted quietly, recalibrated by glances and absences. Cleanliness and color became shorthand for trustworthiness, refinement, and belonging, regardless of truth. In this way, appearance absorbed morality itself. Society learned to read virtue in fabric and fault in shade, allowing judgment to proceed without conversation. What one wore, and how it endured wear, became a permanent testimony, silent but devastatingly articulate. By the height of the Gilded Age, scrutiny no longer required an observer. It had been internalized. Individuals learned to watch themselves with the same cold precision once reserved for others. Every public appearance carried the quiet risk of misinterpretation, and that risk produced a vigilance bordering on dread. To be seen incorrectly was not to be misunderstood. It was to be reclassified. Errors did not need to be dramatic. A coat worn a season too long, a silhouette slow to adjust to shifting fashion, a visible repair that should have remained hidden. Any of these could suggest decline. Aging itself became dangerous when it appeared unmanaged, gray hair unsoftened, lines left unaddressed, posture allowed to yield were read not as natural progression but as surrender. Society tolerated age only when it remained discreet. Illness posed an even greater threat. To appear unwell was to invite assumptions of weakness, instability, or impending dependence. Symptoms were concealed, whenever possible, masked beneath tailored garments and practiced composure. A cough suppressed, a limp explained away, fatigue reframed as elegance. The body was expected to endure quietly, and those who failed to maintain the illusion risked being removed from view altogether. Economic insecurity, too, betrayed itself visually. Wear accumulated despite care. Materials aged beyond fashion. Accessories failed to update. None of these signs required confirmation. They functioned as warnings, alerting society to a possible breach in status. Invitations thinned, social distance widened. The fear was not simply of poverty, but of its visibility. This anxiety extended into social rituals meant to reassure. The promenade, the dinner, the opera, each offered exposure as much as enjoyment. Participation required courage as well as capital. One dressed not only for the occasion, but for every possible angle of observation. Mirrors were consulted obsessively, not for vanity, but for defense. What made this fear particularly cruel was its asymmetry. Society offered no clear boundary between acceptable and unacceptable. One could not know when an appearance had crossed from respectable to questionable until the response arrived, and it rarely arrived directly. Silence replaced warmth. Familiar faces turned briefly away. A greeting shortened, then disappeared. To be seen incorrectly was to vanish without ceremony. The individual remained present, but no longer recognized. In a culture that prized composure above confession, this quiet erasure was the ultimate punishment, delivered not through confrontation, but through withdrawal. Exile in the Gilded Age was rarely announced. It arrived without sound, without witnesses, and without appeal. There were no confrontations, no explanations offered, no charges to refute. One simply discovered, often too late, that the familiar mechanisms of inclusion had quietly disengaged. Invitations failed to arrive. Doors remained politely closed. Recognition, once effortless, required repetition, and even then went unanswered. This exclusion was not dramatic. It was administrative. Society removed individuals the way it corrected seating arrangements or revised guest lists, efficiently, without visible emotion. The offense was seldom named because it did not need to be. Appearance had already rendered judgment. A reputation, once questioned visually, could not be rehabilitated through explanation. Words were powerless against what the eye claimed to know. Those cast into this quiet margin often remained physically present within elite spaces for some time, lingering as diminished figures. They attended fewer gatherings, conversations shortened. Their presence became optional, then inconvenient, then forgotten. No one openly rejected them. That would have implied conflict, and conflict required acknowledgement. Instead, society allowed distance to do the work. What made this exile particularly effective was its ambiguity. The excluded were left to speculate endlessly about the precise moment of failure. Was it a visible decline in fortune? An aging face insufficiently disguised? A lapse in dress that suggested desperation rather than confidence? Without clarity, correction was impossible. The individual could only withdraw further, carrying the suspicion inward until it hardened into certainty. This mechanism preserved the illusion of civility. Society did not punish, it simply adjusted. The removed were not disgraced, merely unmentioned. Their absence required no justification. Silence, after all, left no evidence of cruelty. It was the most refined form of discipline. For those entirely displaced, women without financial protection, men whose authority had faltered, families whose appearances could no longer be maintained, the consequences extended beyond social inconvenience. Networks dissolved, opportunities vanished, respectability, once lost, could not be rented or repaired. Without visibility, one ceased to exist in meaningful terms. In this way, scrutiny functioned as both warning and execution. The gaze observed, the silence concluded, and society moved forward unchanged, reassured by the quiet efficiency with which deviation erased itself. By the time the Gilded Age receded into memory, its houses still stood, its portraits still hung, and its names still circulated. But the system that governed belonging remained largely intact. The rules of appearance were never dismantled. They were merely softened, renamed, and made less visible. Silent scrutiny did not disappear. It learned to adapt. What this world reveals is not simply a fixation on fashion or etiquette, but a culture that preferred judgment without responsibility. By allowing appearance to stand in for truth, society avoided confrontation while enforcing obedience. Inclusion became conditional, exclusion invisible, and cruelty efficient precisely because it was never spoken. The unspoken rules of the Gilded Age remind us that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it lowers its voice, sometimes it looks away, and sometimes it decides, without a word, that someone no longer belongs.